Pastors say it across pulpits every Sunday. The Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. The apostles were convinced that Jesus was the Son of the living God, and the Romans trembled in the aftermath of his crucifixion. But what if I told you that the only ones who believe that are the ones that never check the record for themselves? In today's conversation, I want to share some notes from my private study that give insight into not only why I'm not a believer anymore, but also why I'm starting to lean into the idea that the entire New Testament may be primordial fiction. This one might get me into some trouble, but I think these are some things that need to be said. Let's get into it. Let's start with the problem of the Gospels. All four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are anonymous Greek texts rather than direct eyewitness memoirs. The traditional attributions to Mark the evangelist, Matthew the apostle, Luke the physician, and John the apostle derive from later church tradition and lack solid internal or early external support. The earliest gospel, Mark, shows up around 66 to 70 CE. That's roughly 33 years after Jesus was allegedly crucified. That number raises some flags for me in itself. But Matthew, Luke, and John show up much later, around 90 to 110. And every single one of these letters are written in Greek and are completely anonymous. Let's deal with some unasked questions here. There's a few things we're overlooking. What is the purpose of a letter? To be read. What was the literacy rate in Judea around this time? Rough estimations say less than 3%, which meant if a letter was being written, it was likely being written to an audience in the top 3%. This sort of challenges the narratives that the Gospels were written by the poor, for the poor. It seems that the intended audience of the Gospels were Greek-speaking elites. Now, this points to urban Hellenistic audiences and means the sayings and stories were filtered through translators or scribes who shaped Semitic idioms for Greek readers. So no, the Gospels were not written by passionate individuals who had witnessed Jesus or studied at the feet of someone who did. Nope. They were engineered by teams of translators and scribes decades later who at best were interpreting many different sects of oral history or at worst, fabricating a story to fit an agenda. Because to be clear, if scribes and translators are involved, they're on somebody's payroll. So as you see, my issues with the Gospels are beyond mere spelling and word order differences. They are even beyond the substantial narrative tensions, such as Jairus' daughter's healing timeline shifting between Mark and Luke, and the accounts of Jesus' trial varying in location, timing, and participants, and these are just a few. But these differences suggest that we're not just looking at contradictory narratives, we're looking at competing narratives, likely reflecting different groups' claim to legitimacy through secession, later harmonized to seem univocal. No surviving Greek manuscripts names this author. Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John were appended by 2nd century tradition to confer apostolic weight. Assigning the Gospels to apostolic figures is a classic case of pseudo-biography, intentionally or tacitly attributing a work to a revered authority to bolster its credibility. This casts even more doubt on the legitimacy of any Christian claims that find its roots in the Gospels. So let's talk about how the Gospels were actually named. Let's quickly unpack when and how the Gospels got their authors. First, there's Papias of Hierapolis. This is around 110 to 130 Common Era. Papias, writing in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, is our earliest witness to naming two Gospels. He reports that Matthew composed the oracles Logia in Hebrew dialect, and each translated them as he was able, and that Mark was Peter's interpreter whose writings preserve Peter's teaching. Notice his descriptions don't align with the Greek narrative Gospels and what we actually know. And then there's also Justin Martyr around 150 Common Era. In First Apology and Dialogue with Trypho, Justin calls the Gospels memoirs composed by the apostles, but does not attach individual names to them yet. His claim shows that by mid-2nd century, these texts were starting to be regarded as apostolic in origin, even though still circulating under anonymous titles. There's also the Muratorian canon. This fragmentary list, our earliest surviving proto-canon, accepts 4 Gospels. The first 2 titles are lost, but most certainly Matthew and Mark. The compiler marshals these Gospels alongside Paul's letters as authoritative for Rome's Christian community, reflecting a growing consensus on their status and attribution. And then there's Irenaeus of Lyons. Irenaeus is the first patristic writer to explicitly ascribe each Gospel to its author. Matthew to the tax collector apostle, Mark, Peter's interpreter, Luke to Paul's companion, and John to the beloved disciple at Ephesus. His argument in Against Heresies not only names the four, but defends their equal authority against rival sects, the Marcionites who accepted Luke only. So to be clear, it took early Christians approximately 150 years from the alleged crucifixion, 120 years from the alleged composition of the earliest gospel, and 110 years from Paul's earliest writings for the church to get organized enough to decide who wrote the gospels that they later claimed were handed down by the apostles themselves. Do with that what thou wilt. So what does this mean? This is important to understand because this completely destroys the claim that Gospels were first-hand eyewitness accounts. Not only is it untrue, it's one of the laziest lies that is being echoed in contemporary Christianity, which should reveal an even larger problem with Christianity as it is practiced in the Americas and Africa. The majority of Bible scholars are 100% aware of this fact, and this information is not shielded or hidden. It's freely accessible, yet somehow the majority of Christians and their pastors across the Americas and Africa are 100% convinced that the Gospels are eyewitness claims, and they typically treat that as the reason they trust it. Likely the purpose of the early church fathers attaching that claim in the first place. But the fact that this is the current reality means 99% of American evangelical pastors have never actually studied biblical history in any classical sense. And this is not my first time saying this. You will find interviews where I've talked about coming to this realization that people were pretending to know what they hadn't even tried to know. This, my friends, is the result of colonial missionary Christianity. Christianity's truth claims are trusted because the powers uphold them, not because it's been tested. Now let's talk about the problem with Paul. There are even bigger problems with Paul and his letters. Number one, every single thing that is accepted as true about Paul's life is based on the letters of Paul, though his existence has never been positively confirmed. And again, we have evidence that the early church fathers frequently created personalities and attributed them to points in history to bolster their own credibility. And I'm not convinced that Paul is not one of those characters. The political relationship between Jesus and his apostles seemed no different to me than Elohim and his pantheon, or the Egyptian Enneads or Ogdoads. It is simply primordial origin stories. All of the cults of the time had been doing this for centuries. So let's unpack Paul's historicity. The letters that are considered genuine by Paul are dated 49 to 50 E Common Era, and it's typically done by correlating mentions of his travels, of course from his letters, as well as interactions with the Jerusalem Council in his letters, and then his persecutions under Gallio and his own imprisonments in his letter. Now, scholarly charts place 1 Thessalonians as early as 50 to 51 CE and Romans around 57 to 58 CE. The problem with all of this is that is not how you confirm the existence of a historical figure. The single bit of evidence for biblical scholars that Paul existed is that Gallio existed and Paul mentioned him. Well, I just watched Sinners, again, and they mentioned Capone, so surely Stack is still out here somewhere getting ready to smoke somebody. But even if we go further, after confirming that there was in fact a Gallio, wouldn't the next reasonable question be, does Gallio's record speak about a Paul? After all, he wasn't a random passing by on the street. He was a Roman senator and proconsul who Paul was allegedly brought before. But yet there are no records from him on this encounter or any other Roman or Jewish source at all. And come to think about it, Gallio lived from 5 BC to AD 65. Which means he would have been a contemporary of Paul, Peter, and Jesus, but yet he doesn't mention any of them or any of the disciples, nor does he mention a moment in his lifetime where a bunch of zombies rose from the dead after the crucifixion of a criminal. And even though Paul did a lot of writing to these churches, there's a glaring absence from the record. We possess no extant letters from Corinth or other communities responding directly to Paul. The earliest known reply is actually written by 1 Clement to the Corinthians. So yes, even though Paul wrote all of these letters to these churches and we found all of these letters that Paul wrote, we haven't found a single letter that any of these churches wrote back to Paul. That's a little suspicious. No non-Christian or secular sources from Paul's lifetime mentions his letters. Our chief evidence remains the internal metadata of the epistles themselves, which means any knowledge of Paul comes exclusively from his own letters and the later Acts of the Apostles. Without any non-Christian sources or first-hand archival finds, We cannot conclusively prove that Paul was a historical person rather than a literary construct. The only attestation comes from Christian tradition itself, which is vulnerable to the same pseudo-apocryphal impulses that produces legendary figures in other contexts. Now let's unpack the problem of church history. The question now becomes, and it's a far stretch, but is there any evidence that any of the early church historians may have thought these stories were not reflective of history? It turns out there's plenty of it. Clement of Alexandria argued that symbols, myths, and allegories, what a modern reader might call fables, were deliberately woven into Christian scripture to guide novices toward deeper truth. By treating these mythic elements as didactic tools, not as literal history, Clement effectively endorsed the view that falsehoods could be institutionally profitable. There was also Origen of Alexandria, who carried the allegorical method further, explicitly defending the fables of biblical narratives as vehicles of sublime meaning. In other words, Origen freely admitted that portions of scripture were fictitious in the sense of crafted stories whose value lay in their moral and institutional instruction rather than their factual historicity. And then there's Julian the Apostate, Flavius Claudius Julianus, emperor and nephew of Constantine the Great. He was deeply troubled by these frank admissions. In his now lost polemic against the Galileans, he lampooned Christianity as a faith built on myths and falsehoods, pointing directly to the likes of Clement and Origen as proof that Christians themselves knew their sacred texts were largely allegory. This formed a cornerstone of his broader charge that Christianity was an invented religion of fables. And there is also Eusebius of Caesarea, who I've mentioned before. He is arguably the single most important historian of the 2nd and 3rd century church. He goes on to justify what he calls pious fraud by pointing out that the Old Testament itself uses anthropomorphic fables, God's jealousy, sleep, anger, etc., to accommodate the limited understanding of its audience. Eusebius isn't merely cataloging spurious text here. He's affirming that scriptures has falsehoods that were known to the people of his time and that they were useful for remedial education. This reveals that many of the early church fathers had a shockingly different view of scripture and its historicity than the claim that modern Christianity makes today. So let's go over what we've learned so far. Early Christian gospels were less the straightforward biographies of a historical Jesus than anonymous community-shaping narratives written decades after the events they describe, often to bolster the authority of particular leaders or circles. Here's how the evidence breaks down. You have anonymous Greek text for community confirmation. None of the earliest gospel manuscripts names its author. The traditional titles were added in the 2nd century to connect each text with an apostolic figure. Scholars agree the gospels were composed as anonymous compilations of oral traditions to confirm the faith of their communities, not as neutral histories. Internal clues and manuscript finds date Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John to 66 to 110. 40 to 60 years after Jesus' crucifixion. This gap allowed local groups to adapt circulating stories to serve their own theological agendas. And then there's sectarian authority and competing claims. Each gospel's later attribution helped legitimize a particular strand of the Jesus movement. Matthew, tax collector apostle, reinforces Peter's primacy. You are Peter, the rock. Upon this rock will I build my church, underscoring a Jewish Christian leadership model. Mark, Peter's interpreter, highlights Peter's eyewitness role. Luke, Paul's companion, ties the narrative to Paul's Gentile mission. John elevates the beloved disciple as the insider of the mysteries. These attributions read like early branding exercises, each community claiming direct apostolic sanction. The mid-2nd century Gospel of Marcion rewrote Luke to exclude Jewish Christian elements, illustrating how small Christ cults produce competing gospels to assert their version of orthodoxy. Marcion's community claimed a pure tradition just as other groups did by affiliating with Peter or John. And then we see the primordial myth pattern. This process closely parallels mythic origin stories in other cultures, like Egyptian Kings List and Greek heroic sagas, where legendary founders are retrojected into history to validate later institutions. The New Testament's rapid transition from oral legend to pseudonymous authorship reflects the same impulse: create a lineage of authority that insiders could point to as proof of their group's authenticity. Now let's unpack this and close out our conversation for the day. I now pretty much view the New Testament as primordial fiction. Let me tell you why. There are no contemporaneous footprint for Jesus or the 12 disciples. There are no surviving first-century non-Christian accounts of Jesus' life or deeds. The earliest references, Josephus and Tacitus, are late, contestant, and likely reliant on Christian informants rather than independent reportage. Minimalist scholars argue that the same circular reasoning used to historicize Old Testament figures undermines confidence in a historical Jesus. Our reconstructions depend on the text written decades after the fact and then read back into the life of a supposed founder. And then the apostles. Nothing in the archaeological or literary record of the first century mentions a Peter, James, John, or the other disciples. No inscriptions, no pagan or Jewish historians, no local church archives, even in regions where they're said to have founded communities like Ephesus, Corinth, and Rome. There is no extra-biblical first-hand evidence that ever surfaces. The only proof of their existence is the very text that later communities produced to claim apostolic sanction. We also have to highlight the mythic origin story parallels in other cultures, like the Egyptian king list. Manetho's dynastic histories begins with gods and demigods reigning thousands of years and then descend into semi-divine figures before arriving at human pharaohs. Those lists were clearly designed to retroject divine legitimacy onto later rulers, just as Matthew and John were retrojected onto their respective gospels to confer apostolic weight. Even Homeric epics and early Greek king lists blend myth and memory. The Trojan War heroes straddle history and legend, and local traditions retroactively insert founding figures, like Agamemnon or Menelaus, to validate city-states' origins. Archaeological finds at Historic reignited debate over Troy's reality, but most heroes remain literary constructs used to explain political and religious institutions. And we can't run away from the pseudo-biography and branding of Christian sects. Anonymous texts with later name. All four Gospels circulated anonymously in Greek for decades. Only by the mid-century do we see Papias quoting a Matthew who collected Hebrew and a Mark tied to a Peter, likely an invented tradition to validate competing communities. By 180 Common Era, Irenaeus explicitly names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each linked to a different apostolic circle, to quash rival gospels and assert a unified orthodoxy where one actually didn't exist. His attributions read like marketing copy. Matthew for Jewish Christian claims, Luke for Paul's Gentile mission, John for the beloved disciple insider perspective. And then we also see a rapid transition from oral legend to textual authority, decades late composition. The Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after Jesus' supposed death. Ample time for sects to adapt oral lore for their own agendas, yet too late for any living eyewitness to correct the record. What emerges is not reportage, but theological storytelling, structured to lend each community a genealogy of authority, anchored in a mythic founder. The pattern fits a classic mythogenesis. Small sects codify oral legends into text, append apostolic names to claim unbroken lineage, and thereby institutionalize their authority, mirroring how pharaohs and Greek city-states did exactly the same with their origin myths. Viewed through this lens, Jesus, the 12 disciples, and even some early church fathers function as literary avatars, not verifiable historical individuals. Reframing the canonical Gospels as products of mythogenesis rather than unmediated history invites us to reconsider how early Christian communities forged authority through storytelling. This approach doesn't deny the sociological resonance these narratives hold for many, but it does expose the political and institutional dynamics that shape their creation. As we peel back the layers of pseudonymous authorship and competing oral traditions, we gain a clearer view of the human agendas embedded in Scripture and of how power, persuasion, and myth have always gone hand in hand in the birth of religions, cultures, and societies at large. If you enjoyed this conversation today, explore the other videos on the screen to go deeper. Also consider visiting Windows Shop to find helpful study guides to support your learning and self-discovery. And consider becoming a patron to financially support the channel and power the community. Well, that's all I have for now. Until next time, keep rising.